Ms. Kristina Olney will provide a perspective on U.S. legislative responses. Ms. Olney of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is the Director of the Government Relations for VOC and leads the VOC's engagement with U.S. federal and state policymakers, embassies, and advocacy initiative with human rights allies and captive nations constituencies. Please welcome Ms. Olney.
Thank you, and good evening from Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank our very distinguished experts for their important remarks, and to all of you here with us today for this conference on the Chinese Communist Party's forced organ harvesting. You have just heard the evidence loud and clear from the world's leading experts on this issue. The CCP is targeting prisoners of conscience and religious minorities, particularly Falun Gong practitioners, to harvest their organs for sale in a lucrative global market worth $1 billion. This recent report by my colleague Matthew Robertson, which you can download on the website of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, lays out the evidence that Uyghur Muslims have also been victims of forced organ harvesting, as you have also just heard from my colleague Ethan Gutman in his remarks. From the government-leaked documents exposed by my colleague Dr. Adrian Zenz, we have seen what Beijing is willing to do to control Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in China, incarcerating them in concentration camps, forcibly sterilizing them, and forcing them into modern-day slavery. In November, the United States determined that these crimes constitute genocide, and yesterday, the Canadian House of Commons followed suit. On the issue of forced organ harvesting, the international community has remained silent despite the evidence for far too long. The first U.S. congressional hearing was held on this issue in 1996, and a number of extensive reports, which you've heard about from my co-panelists, have been published on this issue in the last 2 decades. The United States and the rights-respecting nations of the world must confront the evidence of this horrific human rights abuse taking place in China today and hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for its complicity. This crime has no place in the 21st century. In terms of the policy responses to this evidence, I will speak specifically about policy responses here in the United States, and you will shortly hear from the parliamentarians joining us today from Canada, the EU, and Australia about international policy responses. There have been a number of congressional hearings and resolutions condemning forced organ harvesting, but until now, there has been no comprehensive legislation signed into law requiring the U.S. government to address this issue. But in December of last year, Senator Cotton and Representatives Chris Smith and Tom Suozzi introduced the Bicameral, Bipartisan Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. If enacted, this legislation will do the following 4 significant things. Firstly, authorize the U.S. government to sanction officials responsible for human organ trafficking or organ harvesting. Second, mandate an annual report by the State Department on human organ trafficking in foreign countries with a tiered ranking system for determining the countries that have the lowest to highest levels of forced organ harvesting or human organ trafficking, and the countries in the governments where governments are directly or indirectly supporting organ harvesting or trafficking would be subjected to sanctions. Third, require an annual report on U.S. institutions that train organ transplant surgeons affiliated with entities in Tier 3 countries responsible for human organ trafficking. And fourth, prohibit the export of transplant surgery devices to entities responsible for forced organ harvesting. In summary, this bill will shine a light on the crime of organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting globally, and thereby shine a light on the egregious record of the Chinese Communist Party in its state-sponsored forced organ harvesting. It will establish a mechanism to effectively identify and punish the organ harvesters and traffickers who prey on vulnerable populations, including prisoners of conscience and members of ethnic minority and religious groups in China. The STOP Act is one of the most comprehensive legislative initiatives ever introduced on the issue of organ trafficking and one of the most significant international responses to the China Tribunal's judgment to date. The bill will be reintroduced next week by bipartisan leaders in both the Senate and House. We urge the U.S. Congress to swiftly enact this bill and for international governments to pass similar legislation. For those of you asking what you can do to help end the horrific crime of forced organ harvesting, if you are here in the United States, urge your member of Congress to co-sponsor this legislation. And for those of you joining us from the 24 other nations around the world, urge your governments to pass similar legislation. Thank you.